All of these other events are certainly important, but it also brings us to arguably the significant event of the era, the one that marks why we really have that era, and that is the creation of Islam itself, the Muslim religion. It also brings us to a couple of other important concepts. What do we mean by historically significant when I say it's the most significant event of the era? Well, it's significant because it's got importance to a large number of people. And by importance, I'm talking about profound, deeply impacting the people of that time period. It's also important to recognize that it's affecting a large number of people on a much larger, wider basis, not just a little local thing. Recognize, too, the significance in part is determined by its durability, the fact that it endures for long periods of time, and that it is relevant, perhaps even to people today, that it has a lasting impact as well. It is also important to recognize that this again brings us back to a concept of how we define periods, something we've talked about a little bit this year, but need to talk about a little bit more. What is it that marks off one era from another? It's one that has to affect and have significance for large numbers of people in many different areas, not just isolated in one or two places. The rise of Islam assuredly meets that criteria and is, at least according to the College Board, the major event. Most historians would really agree with that. Part of this defined by the creation of the Islamic empires during the first part of this time period. They tie the Eastern Hemisphere together and create significant interregional connections. This includes initially the creation of what's called the Caliphate, the initial Muslim empires, but then eventually real empires ruled by a group called originally the Umayyads. They're replaced by a group called the Abbasids. And when the Abbasid Empire begins to break apart, there are various other groups that we need to look at, perhaps one of the most important being the Turks. The Turks actually composed of two different groups, originally a group that we call the Seljuk Turks, and then a second group, the Ottoman Turks, who last and created an empire that is even longer than that of the others. In addition to all of this, the network is extended beyond just Asia. Now the network is extended into different parts of India and even Africa. When we talk about Africa, we're talking about the interaction of the Muslim people with places like Zimbabwe and Congo and the creation and impact on societies there, but also how it blends with the people in these various regions. When the Muslim world, for example, connects to the Bantu culture that we talked about in the last units, they create an entirely new culture in Eastern Africa that we call Swahili, a mix of the two, syncretism, if you will. There are also some significant trade empires that arise and connect Africa to Asia, Europe, other parts of the world. Most notably, we'll talk about three great trade empires that arise in the western part of sub-Saharan Africa. The empires of Ghana, replaced by the empire of Mali, and then eventually by Songhai. The Muslims even reach parts of Southeast Asia. Some places, like Indonesia, become Muslim in their nature. And indeed, Indonesia is the largest, by population, Muslim nation in the world to this day. But there's other places that begin to get tied into the networks as well. Not just Muslim areas. There's places influenced, for example, by the various Hindu and Buddhist religions out of India and now get tied into the region, notably in Southeast Asia, the Khmer Empire. And so we will need to look at that as well. At the eastern end of Asia, there's other parts of the trade network, most notably China. One has to be a little bit careful about calling it medieval China because medieval is really such a Eurocentric term, but for want of a better way of phrasing it out of this era, that's what we're looking at. And in particular, we're looking at China being bigger and better than ever in terms of the empires that arise. Notably, three of them during this time period. Initially, the rise of the Sui dynasty, one of the shorter of the dynastic groups that arise in China. They are rapidly replaced by a group known as the Tang, one that lasts a great deal longer, about 300 years. after the Tang Dynasty comes the rise of what becomes known as the Sung Dynasty, one that's a little bit smaller but has great cultural impact as well. And then, of course, there's the last of the great pastoral nomadic empires, the rise of the Mongols. They really complete the connection from China to the Middle East that was begun by the Muslim world and create something entirely new. Led initially by this man, Genghis Khan, one of the most notable and interesting characters perhaps in all of history. They build one of the largest, most substantial empires in all of history. And when they fall, near the end of the era that we're talking about, we really see the emergence of an entirely new world. Some important civilizations that arise out of that are pretty straightforward. In China, when the Mongols fall, they are replaced by a group called the Ming Dynasty. Initially, they were influenced by people like the fellow there on the right, a guy by the name of Zhang He, who we're going to be hearing much more about. But ultimately, the Ming create a very different type of a culture and mindset than what had been experienced earlier in China. Another one that we will speak about, albeit very quickly, is the rise of Muscovy, what becomes modern-day Moscow or Russia. Ivan the Great, the fellow you see there on the left, is one of the people that are instrumental in creating that particular empire. The rise and then fall of the Mongol Empire also leads us into a discussion of another significant concept that arises during this time. Some historians, like Peter Stearns as an example, argue that this might be one of the most important concepts of all the things that emerge out of the Middle Age era, and that is the emergence of gunpowder weaponry, and the creation from that of what we call gunpowder empires. China may have invented it, but it was the Mongols who really adapted gunpowder and applied it to warfare and made use of it. However, it wasn't just the Mongols who did so. Ultimately, Europe picked it up from them, mastered it, and it totally changed the power structure of the world. Little nations became rulers of the world because the size and other factors that allowed nations like China and others to dominate prior to this now became only of secondary importance. We'll introduce this concept of gunpowder empires during this unit. It will become a hugely important one afterwards. With the end of the Dark Ages in Europe, Europe begins to emerge into another era, one that we call the High Middle Ages. And that one allows them to rejoin the global network, or at least prepare to do so and make the initial steps on that. What marks the High Middle Ages? The era from arguably, let's call it 1100 to the end of this unit, 1450. Well, one of the important things that begins to occur is the mass urbanization of Europe, the rise of various cities that have influence throughout Western Europe. It's also the emergence of different issues and conflicts between church and state. The entire relationship of Catholicism to the governance of Europe begins to change during the second half of the medieval era. And the result is an era that really we call the end of the Middle Ages. The end of the Middle Ages can arguably be marked by three particularly significant and important events that we need to talk about and consider. One of them is the Crusades, one which really sees the waking up of Europe and the beginning of interconnection with various other eras, for good and for bad. It also is the incidence of the plague, one of the great outbreaks of disease that massively transformed trade and connections with the rest of the world, as well as devastating impact on the society of medieval Europe. And then the last of those events that we'll talk about, the 100 Years' War, one which changed the concept of the nation state and the role of technology in warfare, and thus becomes really significant in changing and bringing an end to the Middle Age era. Meanwhile, outside of those networks that we've been talking about in the Eastern Hemisphere is the Western Hemisphere, where we also see important things going on, most notably the rise of very sophisticated societies with their own networks that connect themselves. We're talking about groups like the natives of North America that have so many different characteristics than what we will have talked about in the Eastern Hemisphere. It's also a group, the Mayans, that we've talked about a little bit so far, and two new groups that enter onto the scene, the Aztecs in what is modern-day Mexico, and the Incas in what is modern-day Peru. These various civilizations are incredibly sophisticated and ones that we should not be taking lightly. They may not yet be part of the world system during this particular unit, but they soon will be, and are laying an important foundation for what is to follow. Having finally looked at the Western Hemisphere as well, it is time for this unit to come to a close. But where exactly will we be? Well, we can start with the fact that the population of the world has grown substantially during this time period. If you look at the chart, you can see the decline that we saw at the end of the classical era from about 250 million people to about 200 million people, with the decline in population in places like Rome and elsewhere. But now, with the rise of new technology, with new crops, with new connections between various civilizations, meaningful growth again begins to happen, and it particularly accelerates after the 9th century as that contact continues to grow and develop. By the end of the period, if you take a look, you can see that the population of the world will have over doubled from where we start the period. Although notice that it's still under 500 million people, less than half a billion people living throughout the entire world during this time. One of the other things that we will have seen happen during this entire unit is the ultimate connection of the Eastern Hemisphere, what we often call Afro-Eurasia. If you take a look and think about it, you can see those connections beginning to take place between the various parts of the Eastern Hemisphere. Of course, that also means that the Western world is waiting its turn and still is waiting to become a part of that. That becomes part of the story of the unit to follow.